Parshas Toldos. We're starting an experiment. We started already last week with Lumdis on the Parsha. And I want to thank David Spiegel for sending you an email if you got it. And if you could open it, that's great. And one of the basic issues in this week's Parsha is Midvar Sheker Tirchak. In fact, when Esav comes in afterwards, Yitzchak says to him, Bo achicha b'mirma, vayikach birchosecha. And the word mirma would seem to indicate that Yaakov stole the brachas and violated the Isur Sheker. And Chazal tell us that chosomo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu emes. The essence of God is truth. And amongst the four groups of people that Hashem will reject and the Shekhinah will not accept, one of the four groups is the Koach HaShakranim, the liars. And yet Yaakov Avinu, who's considered Titein Emes Yaakov, he is the pillar of truth, and yet he goes in and steals the brachas. How do we understand that? Rashi, on this pasuk of Ba'achicha b'mirma, quotes the Targum Onkelos, who says that the word mirma means chachma, that Yaakov Avinu came b'chachma, and it seems that Rashi and Onkelos before him were trying to somehow cover up for Yaakov and say, no, it wasn't mirma, it was chachma. And there are those who say that Rashi tries to cover up for Yaakov by saying that when Yaakov responds to Yitzchak and he says, Ani, and then he takes ki'ilu a pause, and B'choroscha Esav, try to fit it into the words. Okay, it could be that approach might successfully create a situation where the dibur peh, the actual words that came out of his mouth, were not sheker per se, but certainly sheker means when you mislead someone, and if the recipient understands sheker, then that is midvar sheker tirchak, and this is one of the only isurim in the Torah where the Torah adds the word tirchak, stay far away. So it's very odd and paradoxical that Yaakov, whose midah is emes, should be the one who fools his father, no less, and steals the brachas from his brother. And although you might argue that the mahalach of the avos is way above our understanding, and it's based on, shall we say, cheshbonos, calculations which are divine in origin. In fact, there are those who say that Yaakov only did it because of kibud aim, and Rivka only allowed Yaakov to go in there because she had a nevuah to that effect. So that Yaakov was actually acting out a nevuah. There are those who say that Yaakov Avinu himself wanted to get caught. He was hoping, when he said Ulai Yimusheni Avi, he was really hoping, sometimes the word Ulai means, wishful thinking, that Yitzchak would reveal that he is Yaakov and not Esav before actually bestowing the brachos. But be that as it may, we have a principle that the avos from Makayim Kolator Kula before it was given, and certainly Midvar Sheker Tirchak is part of our Torah, so we would expect that Yaakov would observe the prohibition against sheker and would be marchik himself, which he always was, from sheker, and yet here he takes away the brachos. Now, there are two sugyas in Shas about sheker that at the face of it seem to contradict one to the other. The first sugya is in Masechta Shvuos on Daf Lamed. It extends to Daf Lamed Aleph, and there the Gemara seems to assume the underlying premise of the sugya is that Midvar Sheker Tirchak only applies in the context of Bezdin, of a court. And the Gemara derives in a brisa many, many different scenarios that are prohibited under Midvar Sheker Tirchak, and they all apply in Bezdin, within the four walls of a court. For example, the Gemara says that the Dayanim in those days used to appoint certain students. Here in Israel, we would call it a stage. They were sort of learning how to become Dayanim, and they would sit in the Bezdin, and they would actually participate in the court deliberation. And they were obligated to make a point to the judges if they thought that the judges missed a certain point, they were going off on the wrong way. And there are various dinim about these Talmidim requirements. For example, one of the dinim derived by the Gemara from Midvar Sheker Tirchak is that the Dayan is not allowed to introduce or invite an Amoretz, a Talmud who really doesn't know what he's talking about. So there are qualifications for becoming a Talmud in this case and sitting in on the court case. And if the Dayan goes ahead and he introduces a boor, someone who really doesn't deserve to be in the court, that's a violation of Darshat Tirchak. Not only that, if the Dayan is aware of the fact that one of the other Dayanim on the court is really a Gazlan, and therefore he's disqualified, then he, the kosher Dayan, if he goes ahead and sits on the court, together with this Gazlan, with this thief, then he violates Midvar Sheker Tirchak, and so too a witness who comes in with another witness, a companion witness, to make a kat, and he knows that his companion is disqualified for testimony, but the Bezdin doesn't know that, then he's not allowed to give his testimony, even though his testimony is true. But the very fact that he appears in Bezdin with someone who is disqualified, that itself is Midvar Sheker Tirchak. Or, for example, there's a famous case called a din maruma, which means that the Dayan or the Dayanim on the Bezdin, they realize that something is fishy going on over here. There's some sort of, pulling the wool over our eyes. And although they cannot pinpoint exactly where the witnesses or the litigants contradict what they said, but nevertheless they feel in their bones intuitively that there's something rotten in Denmark, as we would say. The famous story about the Vilna Gaon, that the Dayanim on a certain case knew, but they couldn't prove it, that the witnesses were plagiarizing, were falsifying their testimony. So they called in the Vilna Gaon, and they asked him if he could somehow participate. Maybe he could figure this out. And they say what the Gaon did was he took each aide separately into a room and interrogated each aide. And what he found was that each witness said exactly word for word what the other witness said. So he started screaming at them and saying, threatening them that they're going to be put into cherem. I don't know exactly what he said to them. And they finally kowtowed. He knew, the Gaon, that this was a din maruma because it's impossible for two people to come up with the same formulation word for word. My wife, my Rebbitzin, tells me that when she took psychology in college, so the professor organized a setup, so to speak, in order to test them in psychology, teach them a lesson in psychology, and he had someone come into the class with ki'ilu a gun. It wasn't a real gun, obviously, and he shot the gun. Anyway, when the guy left, the professor interrogated the students and asked a bunch of questions. And for every question, he got 15 different answers. No two people would say the same thing. No two people see the same thing. So that's called a din maruma. And in all these cases, the Gemara says that since we're dealing with a Bezdin, a court case, there's a violation of Midvar Sheker Tirchak. In fact, the pasuk itself, Midvar Sheker Tirchak, appears in the Torah in the context of various kinds of people who cheat and steal and use Bezdin to protect their interests when they're falsifying the case. So that's one sugya, and that's a sugya in Shavuos, as we said before. That sugya seems to be predicated on the premise that Midvar Sheker Tirchak only applies to something in Bezdin. Now, in the case of Yaakov Avinu, he's outside of Bezdin, and therefore we could possibly justify that there's no violation of Midvar Sheker Tirchak. However, as I indicated, there's another sugya, and that's a sugya in Ksubis on Daf Yud Zayin. It's a famous sugya that we all know about called Keitzad Meragde B'fnei Akala. And Beis Hillel are of the opinion that no matter what she looks like and what her physical appearances are, he could always say Kala no v'chasuda. Beis Shammai say, what are you talking about? She's a chigeres, she's a hinkadika, she limps around, and she's this and she's that, and you're going to tell me that she's a kala no v'chasuda? She's this beautiful, charming kala? I mean, that's midvar sheker tircha. And it's interesting that Beis Hillel doesn't really respond to Beit Shammai. All he does is he gives like a mushal. Beit Shammai say, well, what happens if a person purchased something? Like, I'll give you an example today. It would be very relevant. You go into a store, into, let's say, a used car dealer, and you buy a used automobile, and you spend, I don't know, in Canadian money, but a lot of money. And then a guy comes over to you after you made the purchase and you already gave the money, you already transferred the bucks, and he says, you got a lemon, this car is not a good car, you got a bad car. So that's not what you should say to a person once it's too late, unless there's a policy that you can return. But if there's a no return policy, tell him, oh, very nice. You're allowed to say something that's not exactly true and falsify the truth. So Beis Hillel, although never responding head on, to the taina of midvar sheker tirchak, but he does say liolam yehei daito shaladam ureves abrios. But one thing we see clearly from this Gemara, because Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel both seem to agree that we could apply midvar sheker tirchak in this case when you're describing the kala. Although, according to Beis Hillel, you may find a heter for it, and there may be some reason to permit it, but you're only being matir an Isur Torah of sheker. And here we're certainly not talking about the context of Bezdin. So how do we reconcile these two sugyas, both of which seem to be predicated on mutually exclusive premises? One sugya is based on the premise that midvar sheker tirchak applies to dayonim in Bezdin, and only to dayonim in Bezdin and Eidim and litigants in a court case. And the other sugya seems to assume that sheker is something you have to avoid under the Isur Lav of midvar sheker tirchak in all situations, all of life situations. And certainly we have to agree with the Gemara Ksubas from a perspective of the Agadatos and all the statements about Chazal that Chazal have about God's essence being emes, and about the kat hashakronim that will never be roim p'nei shchina, certainly on that level. Now, let's take a look at the Monei HaMitzvos. As you know, there were many Rishonim, a whole cadre of Rishonim, and even before the Rishonim, that calculated and enumerated the Taryag mitzvahs. Do they count sheker in the Taryag? And here we find a very fundamental controversy on this issue. The Rambam, in his Sefer HaMitzvos, does not have midvar sheker tirchak as one of the Taryag. He completely omits it. He does have another lav of Lotish Shema Shem Al Hashav, which has to do with Dayanim. The Chinuch, who almost always anyway, follows in suit with the Rambam, likewise, does not have midvar sheker tirchak in the Taryag mitzvahs. However, on the other hand, there's a whole group of Rishonim, and I'll mention their names just in passing, and that is the Smag, the Smak, and the Sefer Yereim of Rabbi Elazar Mimetz, one of the Balei HaTosfos. He and others count midvar sheker based on the Gemara Ksubas that we mentioned as applying even outside of Bezdin, and it's considered one of the prohibitions that are part of and make up the Taryag mitzvahs. If you look, for example, in Rabbeinu Yonah and Shari Tshuva, he has a list of all sorts of types of shakranim. He's got 9 groups of shakranim, and he's megana them. He says very bad things about them, and he quotes all these Midrashi Chazal, and he writes, Over mishum dvar sheker tirchak. It seems that he does include, to some extent at least, the dvar sheker tirchak as a general, broad kind of Isur in the Torah. And the question is, when we look at the Sefer Yereim that I mentioned, he adds the following statement. He says that sheker is only prohibited when somebody suffers a loss, a hefsed, as a result of the sheker. And he says that although normally that would apply in Bezdin, but there are many situations, scenarios in which even outside of Bezdin, you cause someone a loss by saying sheker, by falsifying the truth. And therefore he says that the Isa sheker applies even outside of Bezdin, only conditional on the fact that you cause someone a loss. So for example, if I were to tell you now that it's raining or freezing cold, that would be sheker, but it's not, according to the Rebbe, a violation of any Isur, because nobody takes a loss by the fact that I told you it's raining. But if, on the other hand, somebody would say, "Oh, I'm not going to go to the bank and put my money in the bank because Berzon said it was raining and it's not raining," so then maybe he suffers a loss. That would be mitzvah sheker tircha. And in the case of Yaakov, there's no question about it. Esav suffers a loss. In fact, Esav's response when he finds out that Yaakov stole the brachos is that Vaistameda Belibo, he hates Yaakov and he declares to himself that he will destroy Yaakov, which sounds very relevant today, by the way. And if it's not Esav, call it Yishmael, whoever you want to call it, but it's the ganze Welt. And somebody from our group told me that he commutes to work every day from Toronto. So, my first response was just be careful. You know what I mean? Because I don't know what goes on in Canada, but New York is not much better. Anyway, getting back to this. So if you got the pages that David was kind to send you in the email, you'll see, and this is part of our experiment for Lumdus on the Parsha, that Rav Osher Zelig Weiss comes up with a brand new theory in order to explain how the Rambam and the Chinuch omitted Midvar Sheker Tirchak despite the Gemara in Ksubis. Now, before we look at Rav Weiss's approach, which is somewhat revolutionary, I want to point out that it could be that according to the Rambam, all those Gemaras, like the Gemara in Ksubis, and there are many others that indicate that you're not allowed to falsify the truth, they're all based on what we call midos. Meaning, the Torah says, v'halachta b'drachav, you have to imitate God, imitatio Deo in fancy Latin. And if God's midah and his chosemes is emes, then we have to follow suit. And there are many, many books, some of which we try to learn, try to teach, that deal with midos. The Rambam himself has Hilchas Deos, and the word Deos is a synonym for the word midos. And the Rambam says that Yesh Bechlal included in this section called Hilchas Deos is Ve'alachta b'drachav. And let's go even a step further. Even if the Rambam does not count Midvar Sheker Tirchak in the Taryag, but nevertheless, there's something called a mitzvah sichlis, and according to many Rishonim, that which is logical is something that is mechayev us, and that might even apply to Bnei Noach, let alone to Yisraeli. They say in the name of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the movement of the Muslim movement, that he said the first mitzvah in the Torah is Zainish Kenar. Don't be, seichel. You have to use your seichel. God gave you seichel. And not to show off my great, vast knowledge of philosophy, but, Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher some 150 years ago, less even, he came up with something called the categorical imperative, which means that which is moral is that which, an action that others could follow suit, you can universalize your action. But if you have an action that if everyone would do that action, the whole world would go under. His first example is murder, because obviously if everybody murders, then the whole world is destroyed. and that is a violation of the basic law of morality called the categorical imperative. He goes on to speak about falsifying the truth, and he vacillates back and forth in his great writings as to whether or not that would also, because imagine if the whole world just, well, that's what it is. Anyway, you don't have to imagine it. But so now we get to this point of Rabbi Weiss, Shlita, and I have to tell you by introduction that this idea I heard from my Rebbe Rav Soloveitchik many, many years ago. And I'll tell you how the two words that he coined, a phrase which I remember from my childhood, is something called a lav tafel. And again, if you were a student of mine, you would have to write this down on a piece of paper because I'm going to hold you responsible for it. You're going to have to take an exam. And it's called a lav tafel. Tafel means tet, pei, lamed, sort of like a secondary lav. The Rambam very often will distinguish between that which is explicit in the Torah and that which is derived from Chazal, through biblical exegesis. For example, and I remember the Rav specifically honed in on this case, and that is the Isur Hana from Basar B'chol. So if you cook meat and milk, you violate an explicit lav of lo tevashel gedi b'chalei v'imo, and you get malchus for that, if there was Edom and Asra. If you eat Basar B'cholav, that's also included in that Isur, and you get malchus. But the Rambam says that the third time the Torah repeats itself, lo tevashel gedi, it's referring to an Isur Hana. So whereas I can take a piece of nevela, or even for that matter, Avram and Achai, and feed it to my dog, I cannot feed my dog Basar B'cholav. And the Rambam says you don't get malchus if you violate the Isur Hana. And here the Rambam in his Pirush HaMishnayos in Masechta Krisus has something called, that he himself, the Rambam, calls the Nekuda Nifla. And he basically argues, again, this is a long discussion for a shir, for an hour at least, that Isur Achila is really just one form of the Isur Hana. But nevertheless, the Isur Hana is not explicit in the Torah, and therefore the Rambam says that you don't get malchus. And the Rav coined a phrase here, and he called it a lav tafel. What does it mean, a lav tafel? A lav tafel means that you don't get a punishment for it because it's not the ikar lav. It's not the primary lav. It's what you might call a secondary lav. Now, although Rav Weiss doesn't use the term lav tafel, but he does say something very, very similar. And his point is that if you take a look at the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs, in Mitzvahs Aseh Pei Tes, which is the mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim, and for those who are learning the Daf Yomi, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The Rambam codifies a mitzvah to eat Kodshim, but he limits it to Kodshe Kodshim. Now, we know that only Kohanim are allowed to eat Kodshe Kodshim, whether it be Chatos or V'osham, not Yisraeli. So even a magnanimous Kohen who got a piece of the meat from a korban that was Chatos, he cannot share it with the Yisrael, with a non-Kohen. But there is a possibility for a non-Kohen to eat Basar Kodshim in the case of Kodshim Kalim. For example, Shlomim. And Shlomim is Nechal Abaylam. But the Rambam says that when the Torah commands the eating of Basar Kodshim, it says, V'yochel so masher kupar behem, clearly referring to the Kohanim and not to the Israelim. But the Rambam writes, V'hanigrarim achar mitzvah zu, which, if I can use a Yiddish word, means nachschlepper, that what's slept along with this mitzvah, you have like a U-Haul and it's carrying something along, is the mitzvah of achilas kodshim kalim al yidei abaylim. Well, in some cases, they can share it with others. So on the one hand, the Rambam says that the mitzvah of achilas kodshim, as it's indicated by Pshuto Shavikra, is incumbent upon the Kohen. But on the other hand, he says nigrorim imo. There's some other expansion of the mitzvah that is that is schlepped along with it, and that's the Achilas Bailim, who are Yisraelim of Kodshim Kalam. So this would be, in the Rambam's frame of reference, one example of an expansion in which we extend the mitzvah of a Torah to an expansion, but the expansion still remains outside of the purview of the Ikar mitzvah. So it would not be counted in Taryag. He gives a second Rambam, where he doesn't mention where it is, but we can find it, and that's a mitzvah v'samachta b'chagecha. And the Rambam says, although the mitzvah v'samachta b'chagecha requires that we eat basar kodshim from the korban chagiga, the korban simcha, whatever korbanos they bring on yontif, but nevertheless, there are many other different forms of simcha. So for the benefit of the women folk, we'll say, well, you should buy your wife a pair of earrings for yontif. And that too is a part of simcha. And every person has their own experience of simcha. But that's an expansion of the essay of Samachta B'Chagech. It's not the Iker essay. He goes on to point out, but this I don't think is in the Rambam, that Baltashkis actually only applies to what's called an Eitz Ose Pri, only to a tree that gives fruit. And it may possibly only apply in the context of Milchama. But be that as it may, we've expanded the Isser of Baltashkis to include a host of different situations and scenarios in which you destroy something that has value. So that again is an expansion of the Ikar mitzvah. It's not the Ikar mitzvah, but an expansion. And he wants to suggest here that maybe Midvar Sheker Tirchak, according to the Rambam, although it's not counted in the Taryag, but nevertheless it is included in this expansion kind of definition of the mitzvah. So that if you expand the mitzvah of Dayanim, where the Dayanim have to avoid at all costs any sort of sheker, so we expand it outside the four walls of the Bezdin, and that's called, again, if I would use the Rav Soloveitchik's terminology, at least that would be a lav tofa. And if that be the case, the Gemara in Ksubas of Kalinova Chasuda should be understood in that context. That when Beit Shammai quote the pasuk Midvar Sheker Tirchak, Beis Hillel don't even bother responding because they know that that's not the Ikar Avera of Sheker. The Ikar Avera of Sheker is in Bezdin, has nothing to do with the chuppah and after the chuppah. But nevertheless, Beis Hillel have to contend with this because they realize that sheker is prohibited, if not under the Ikar mitzvah, but under the expansion of the mitzvah. And in that sense, we really have not resolved our issue about Yaakov Avinu, because even if you'll tell me that Yaakov stealing the brachos did not occur in Bezdin, but nevertheless it was a sheker, which according to the Sefer Yereim certainly would qualify as a violation of sheker because it causes a loss to Esav, how is Yaakov allowed to do this? And here we get into another branch of sheker, and that is, under what conditions do Chazal allow a person to fabricate the truth? Otherwise known as hamatirim. Matirim means situations in which, or principles which permit sheker. So, for example, we have the case of Sarah Imenu, who laughs when she finds out that she's going to bear a child, and she says Vadoni Zakein, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu leaves that out when he tells over to Avram what she said or what she thought. And Chazal derived from this a principle of Mishanim Ibnei Shalom, that for peace and harmony you're allowed to fabricate the truth. Or, for example, when Yaakov Avinu dies, the brothers come to Yosef and they make up a whole story about what Yaakov commanded them before he died, not to take revenge against them. Now, you and I know that it would be absolutely natural for the brothers to want to, for Yosef, I should say, to want to take revenge against the brothers who sold him down the river. I don't have to tell you about that. But they invented this whole story. And the reason they invented this story is obviously in order to create a peaceful relationship with Yosef. Another case that we have is a famous Gemara about Mitzia. You're allowed to return an Aveda through Tvias Ayin, which means even in a case where the person who's claiming the Aveda does not have a Simon, but only if he's someone who never lies. But the Gemara there says under three exceptional cases, he's allowed to lie. And these are Mesechta, meaning, let's say you ask me, do I know, well, in my case, it would not be Sheker anyway, but let's say theoretically, if I knew a Mesechta, and you asked me if I know the Mesechta, and I told you I don't know the Mesechta, because I'm humble, but again, that doesn't apply in my case, but I have the yahrzeit of my mother-in-law coming up, so they said to me, Azaria, you're a Shas mensch. I mean, you're doing Daf Yomi now for 5 years, so pick a Masechta and make a Siyum on it. Well, I couldn't come up with any Masechta that could make a Siyum on. Anyway, and the second case that you're allowed to lie at is called Puria. If they ask you about something about your relations with your wife, some private business, so there's Siyus, you don't have to lie, you don't have to tell them the truth, they wonder, why did you go to mikveh this morning? Anyway, and then there's Ushpiza. Somebody asks you, where do I get the good grub? I mean, you ate it in so-and-so's house, you were a guest. Tell me if that host really gives you the good stuff. Is he making barbecues out in the snow like they used to do in Clinton Park? Anyway, and you don't have to tell him the truth, because if you tell him how good the food was in the snow, then he's going to just jump in there, and the host is going to be, they'll take every last penny out. So these are cases in which you're allowed to lie. However, it's very fascinating that the Rishonim say that as a general rule, don't just take a carte blanche and say, okay, I'm allowed to lie, and apply it, mutter gedar should say it's always mutter. No, you really have to get a horas chacham. And if the purpose of building Klal Yisrael through the Zerah of Yitzchak is through Yaakov, Kivi Yitzchak, Yikar Yaakov, because Yishmael is out of the picture. Now we have to get Esav out of the picture. So then taking the brachos is really, in a sense, a building block for building all of Klal Yisrael. Now, in general, we don't come up with heterim and allow, violations of Torah law for the sake of, this will bring about the geula, or in Lubavitch, they sing, we want Mashiach now. So, for example, they once asked the Brisker Rav if somebody told him that if we would violate this Isur, one particular Ma'isa Avera, and not only that, it's only Asur D'Rabbanan, and then the Mashiach would come, are you allowed to violate an Isur D'Rabbanan for the sake of bringing the Mashiach? And he said, no, you're not allowed to. That's the difference between a Litvak and a Chos. Anyway, so it turns out that, when you want to bend the laws, you really have to come up with a very, very solid heter to lie and fabricate the truth. But in the case of Yaakov, we're trying to build Klal Yisrael. And Chazal tell us that if Esav would have maintained his status as the Bechor, then the Kohanim, or the Bechoros in the original selection, would have been from Esav. I mean, so we're dealing with some very serious issues over here about the making of Klal Yisrael. And again, even though you need a heter, so Yaakov had the heter from Rivka, and Rivka in turn from the Eibishter through Nevuah. In any event, it's very interesting, just to end this particular part of the Shir, because we're running out of time, that the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Yud Aleph has a case where the Gedolei HaTanoim, the greats of the Tanoim, actually fabricated the truth in order to save someone from Boshes Panim. It's a whole story there in the Gemara. But once again, these were, Gedolei Yisrael. I don't know if you and I could go ahead simply carte blanche and say, well, we have to allow sheker. But now, in the little amount of time that we have left, I want to move on to another question about Yaakov stealing the brachos. And I think it's like mashlim. It sort of completes what we started with. The pasuk says that in the aftermath of Yaakov taking the brachos, Vayistam Esav es Yaakov ala bracha, etc., etc. Vayomer Esav b'libo yikarvu yimei evel avi ve'argenu v'arga es Yaakov achi. And in the Minchas Asher, he comes up with the following question, which I thought was fascinating. A hanhaga, when you do an action, you have to calculate what will be the repercussions of your action. And the premise that Rav Weiss operates with, unless you want to reject it, is that Yaakov knew very well that Esau was going to come back from the Sada, and he would discover that Yaakov had stolen the brachos, and here's the punchline, it would be natural for Yaakov to understand that a person like Esau would certainly take revenge against him and murder him, or try to murder him, which he did. So Rav Weiss claims, based on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, that if you do X, and as a result somebody else is going to violate the Torah law, you yourself have violated the Torah law, even though you didn't do anything in violation. What you did was mutter. It was perfectly permissible, but as a result, it was clear that someone else would violate their Isur. And that's called, in the language of the Torah, lifnei iver lo sitei michshal. So literally, lifnei iver means not putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person, but Chazal understood it, al pi Torah shebal peh, that this is indicative that you can't do anything that would trip someone up and cause them to violate the Torah. And therefore, the Gemara says that if a Nazir wants wine and you go ahead and give him wine to drink, again, there are different cases. There's Treya Brindanari, where it's on the other side of the river and you're the only one who has access to bring it to him, or it's even Chari Brindanari, which is only D'Rabbanan, but it's also Lifnei Iver. You're not allowed to supply. And even in the case where you buy something from a Gazlan, which encourages the Gazlan to steal because you're a fence, but the Gemara in Avodah Zarah has a different case, which is called Yom Edyom. Right? They had the idol worshippers had certain days that they had festivities, and those were days in which they sang the praises of their idols and their gods. And a Jew is forbidden from doing business with this idol worshiper for 30 days before Yom Edyom, because this puts the guy in a great mood. He's really happy that he was able to buy this merchandise from a Jew. And apparently the Goyim knew that a deal with a Jew is a good deal. And therefore he's going to start praising his God. So you have violated Lifnei Iver Lo Sitei Michshal. Not a case like, for example, Terach is selling idols. And if he appoints his son Avram to take over and sell idols, so that would be Lifnei Iver when he gives an idol to a Goy. That for sure is Lifnei Iver. That's like the case of giving wine to a Nazir. But in a case where you are simply doing a business transaction with a guy, it's perfectly mutter, and yet the Gemara says it's a violation of Lifnei Iver. Why? Because as a result, you are causing the guy to violate one of his Sheva Mitzvahs, namely Avodah Zarah. And therefore, in the case of Yaakov Avinu, how could he go ahead and do something that's going to cause Esau to eventually murder him or try to murder him? And in doing so, Yaakov is violating Lifnei Iver Lo Sitei Michshal. So until now, we discussed Yaakov in terms of violating Lifnei Iver and violating Midvar Sheker Tirchav. Now we move on, and we want to know what about Yaakov and Lifnei Iver. Again, if you want to assume that Yaakov was naive and he didn't realize what Esau's response was going to be, okay, Nicha, you can get away with it. But if you buy in and embrace the premise here of Rav Weiss that Yaakov was very much aware of what Esau's plan would be when he found out and discovered that Yaakov had stolen the brachos, then it's Lifnei Iver. And Rav Weiss here, in this essay, comes up with an unbelievable chiddush. Now, in order to appreciate in the few moments that we have left how radical this chiddush is, I will quote to you a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein in Igros Moshe. And here's the issue. Imagine if you're making a Friday night simcha, and you want to invite all your friends, relatives, neighbors, whatever you are, and you rent, just for Friday night, I'll call it a simcha hall. What do you call that in English? A banquet hall, we'll call it. And you know, in this case, it happened to be the question was posed where a Jewish lady owned this banquet hall and she was renting it out to this Jewish simcha. You know very well that after the simcha ends at midnight on Friday night, she is going to shut out the lights because she's not religious. She's a Jewess, but she's not Shomeres Shabbos. So what would you say, Rabbosai? Are you in violation of Lifnei Iver? Says Rabbosai, yes. This is prohibited. You are not allowed to do such a thing, enter in such a deal, rent out the hall for Friday night, knowing full well that she is going to violate the Shabbos because you're causing her to violate the Shabbos. Joe. I'm sorry, I can't.
I just had to get my
now I hear you.
microphone on. No, I was just wondering if maybe it's a different because there's the issue with regards to Lifnei Iver. If it's only because of you, it's not necessarily it's she's just going to rent it to somebody else. It's not you're not.
So that's what I'm telling you. What you accomplish here, Joe, is that you reduce Lifnei Iver from a Do'oraisa to a Drabanan. Meaning, if it's Trey Ibra Denari and there's no one there to bring the yayin to the Nazir, that's Lifnei Iver Do'oraisa. But if it's accessible to him, but you're making it easier for him, that's Lifnei Iver D'Rabbanan. So now she doesn't have necessarily anyone else right this moment. Maybe she'll find somebody, maybe she won't. But you're making it easier for her by offering to pay her the rental, and Rav Moshe says that's prohibited. Now, I'm not familiar with too many contemporary poskim who will be matir, who will permit something against Rav Moshe Feinstein. But such a person would have to really be in a high caliber. Because I don't want to tell you how much Torah Rav Moshe Feinstein knew. And as a general rule, he was makil only when he was absolutely convinced. And in this case, which is atypical Rav Moshe, he couldn't come up with a heter, and he said it was awesome. Comes along Rav Weiss, and he says it's mutter. Go ahead and rent the hall. Now, in order to justify his conclusion, and we have to finish up because we got to take care of Mincha, and although my sister's not going to be there, but she's in America right now. But normally, anyway, so in the case of the Pinsk, what was I saying? Oh, in the case of the definition of Lifnei Iver, comes along Rav Weiss, and he says Lifnei Iver comes under one of two categories. There are only two cases where you can violate Lifnei Iver. Category number one is where you take a Chefetz D'Isura by hand and give it to someone who's going to eat it or violate whatever Isur it is by your giving it over to his hand. I.e., a Nazir when you give him the yain. Clearly, that has no application, neither to the case of Rav Moshe Feinstein, nor to the case of Yaakov and Esau. But the second category, says Rav Weiss, is when you are a direct cause in a sense that you're almost considered like a participant in the Avera. If the other person decides, based on their own violation and their own will, that's not Lifnei Iver. On the contrary, the Torah, the Shas is full of a phrase which is called Haliteni l'Rosh V'Yamos. If he wants to violate the Torah, let him die. That's not your issue. So I'm going to read to you, as we end the shir, a case, the following case. This is a sugya in Avodah Zarah Daf Samach Gimel. The Gemara says man has Paul, he's got workers, they're Jewish. And is he allowed to say to them, quote, L'chu ve'ichlu b'dinar zeh, tz'u u'shesu b'dinar zeh. He gives them a dinar. Let's say they have a lunch break. He's the balabais, hired these workers. And he says, you know what? Take this dinar that I'm paying you. It's like I'm paying you in advance. And go buy yourself lunch or dinner. He knows, the balabais, very well that they will violate the Isa Shvius because what's out there in the market that's being sold is illegitimately being sold and it's Pero Shvius. Alternatively, he knows that what's out there in the market is Maser. And this Maser has to be taken to Yerushalayim. So Lechora asks Rav Weiss, what's the final conclusion of this Gemara? It's mutter to do so and give the Olim a dinar. Why is that different, asks Rav Weiss, from giving macholos asuros to someone that's going to eat it? You know, he needs the basar b'cholov, so you give him the basar b'cholov. He needs the yayin, the nazir. Says Rav Weiss, what do you see from here? Kevon she'eno nosein lehem shum isur. He's giving them a dinar. Afal pishi odeahu sheyikno. They'll purchase b'dinar zeh mashu osu machal asuros. Lo netztavinu el shalola says michshal. Right? The original pasuk says, I put a michshal down. I gave you something which is a michshal. However, a dinar is not a michshal. A dinar could be used for any number of things. You want to go ahead, you the poel, and use that dinar to buy something else, so fine, that's your problem. It's not my problem. I didn't put a michshal. I gave you a dinar. And therefore, there's got to be some action here in order to qualify as a violation of Lutevir, which is tripping someone up. And he quotes a Gemara in Kiddushin, and with this we'll conclude, a fascinating Gemara on Daf Lamed Beis, that there was an Amora who wanted to test his son to see if his son would get angry. And he broke Kalim in front of his son. And the Gemara says he violates Lifnei Iver. Why does he violate Lifnei Iver? Because he's doing an action which sets up a michshal. Because if you see someone breaking kalim that are of value, you're going to get angry at him. It's an absolutely natural response, and you actively put something in front of him which could be qualified as a michshal, namely shviras kalim. But to rent a banquet hall on Shabbos, on Friday night, is not a michshal. That's like the case of a dinar, according to Rav Weiss, which is not a michshal per se, and it's your headache, you meaning the Paulim, if you decide to use that dinar illegally from a Torah perspective and buy machalos asuros. And therefore, says Rav Weiss, Yaakov Avinu did not violate Lifnei Iver. Yaakov Avinu didn't give machalos asuros. Not only that, he didn't even put a michshal in front of it. If Esav decides that because Yaakov took the brachos, he's going to go ahead and kill Yaakov, that's Esav's problem. Now, we both say we ran out of time now, but I want you to think about this because I would spend a little time with you if we had it to justify the conclusion of Moshe Feinstein here, which would be against Yaakov Avinu and against the conclusion of Rav Weiss. So we're going to stop here, and in our parts of the world, we're going to daven Mincha now, and wish you a great week.
I have a question. Ask a question?
He has to go.
Okay, whatever.
Okay, 2 minutes. I give you 2 minutes because
okay, so
daven with the Hasidim. The Hasidim daven a little later.
Right.
So.
Let's take the case of the dining room, right, where the lady rents it out, etc.
Yeah.
So let's say that the owner specifies every hour of electricity extra used beyond a certain time you're paying for. Is that Lefnever then?
You
So
mean
then
to
she could
say
turn
that you're
lights.
paying for the use of the electricity.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's already a michshol. Why? Because she's indicating that she doesn't want the electricity to go on. So you know, in the context of the agreement that you signed in the contract, that there's going to be
Well,
someone
David,
who's gonna
then
shut the
you
lights.
could just say,
I
I'll pay
guess.
for the whole Shabbos. I'll pay for the whole Shabbos electricity then. If you're
Oh,
paying,
Yeah.
okay. That might be interesting.
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's a difference.
David,
no,
according to Bobby, you're going to have to pay for the
yeah, just tell
electricity.
her don't shut the lights and I'll pay the whole thing.
Yeah, I'll pay. You have to go ahead and
Right.
make
That's
that
If you're
agreement,
getting
and
charged
that's going to
for it.
cost you a pretty penny. I don't know. Maybe in Canada, electricity doesn't cost money, but here, it could cost you 24 hours of electricity. I mean, it's a big banquet
Okay.
hall. All right, gentlemen, thank you
Well,
so
good.
So,
much. And thanks,
Thank
David.
you.
A special thanks to David for taking care of the
Go ahead. Go
of
ahead.
the email.
Yeah.
And we'll have to work this out, David, and see how we can solve this problem because
Yeah.
I think it's a good experiment. I don't know. I hope you're enjoying it. This is
Yeah.
it's a lot
Yeah.
different than learning the Ramban, and the Ramban is much more accessible. But this is what it looks like. Okay, and it's 5 volumes. It's not going to be cheap.
Okay.
I imagine in Canadian money, it's probably $300 or something like that. But maybe, but again,
We'll see. Maybe we can get it donated to the school.
yeah, maybe the shul wants to build up its library. This is something that's kedai. I mean, you could disagree with Rav Weiss, but the man has it all at his fingertips. I mean, it's very impressive.
Yeah.
And for me, this is brand new. So this is like an experiment for me. Okay, then
Got
all
it.
the best.